So our next speaker is Emi Mahmoud, who recently marched 1,000 kilometers in 30 days for peace across Sudan, named one of BBC's 100 most inspirational women, a Yale Global Health Scholar, a World Slam Poet Champion, and the 2016 Woman of the World Co-Champion. This Sudanese American combines poetry and advocacy in her work as a Goodwill Ambassador for UNHCR. Please welcome Emi to the stage.
See, so I'm putting my jacket on. Okay, I'm just going to start, and I hope this is meaningful to you. Cool. This poem is called People Like Us, and it's about where I'm from. Memories of my childhood live between the rings of sand around my ankles and the desert heat in my lungs. I still believe that nothing washes worry from tired skin better than the Nile and my grandma's hands. Every day, I go to school with the weight of dead neighbors on my shoulders. The first time I saw bomb smoke, it didn't whine and billow like the heat from the kitchen hearth, but it forced itself on the Darfur sky, smothering the sun with tears that it stole from our bodies. The worst thing about genocide isn't the hunger, the murder, the politics, the government-paid soldiers that chase you across borders and into camps. It's the silence. For 3 months, they closed the schools down because people like us are an eyesore. So the first month, we took it. The second, we waited. The third month, we met underneath the date palm trees, drinking up every second our teachers gave us, turning fruit pits into fractions. On the last day, they came with a message, put them in their place. We didn't stand a chance because flesh was never meant to dance with silver bullets. So we prayed for the sun to come and melt daggers from our backs, lifted our voices up to God until the clouds were spent for weeping, and the sand beneath our toes echoed with the song of every soul that ever walked before us. I hid underneath the bed that day with 4 other people. 12 years later, and I can't help but wonder where my cousins hid when the soldiers torched the houses, to the bodies in the wells, so if the weapons didn't get you, the poison would, and sometimes they didn't want to use bullets because it would cost them more than we did. What does it matter? I've seen 16 ways to stop a heart when you build nations on someone's bones. What sense does it make to break them? In one day, my mother choked on rifle smoke. My father washed the blood from his face. My uncles carried half the bodies to the hospital and the rest to the grave, and we watched. For every funeral we planned, there were 60. We couldn't have the sand, and the Sahara tastes a lot like powdered bone. And when the soldiers came, our blood on their ankles, I remember their laces, scarlet footprints on the floor. I remember waking to the sound of hushed voices in the night, etched with the kind of sorrow that turns even the loudest dreams to ash. Our parents came home with broken collarbones and the taste of fear carved into their skin, and it was impossible to believe in anything. Fear is the coldest thing in the desert, and it burns you, bows you down to half your height, and owns you, and no one hears you, because what could grow in the desert anyway? Thank you. So at some point in that poem, I was 7 years old and hiding under the bed in Sudan, in Darfur specifically, which is where I'm from originally. I had no idea what was going to happen next, if we're going to make it to the next day. All I knew is that we were just waiting for our parents to come home and see what happens. 12 years after that, I was the closing speaker, actually 15 years after that, not 12 years, oops, math. I was 15 years after that day, I was the closing speaker at my Yale graduation. And I had a moment to just reflect on that journey from that place to a whole other place. A journey that even started before that moment when I was 7, because when we left Sudan, I was 1. We moved to Yemen as refugees, with my dad as a doctor, my mom a medical lab technician. So it was different than what you're used to. And then we got the visa lottery and came to the US. And things changed and things evolved. What I want to say, though, is when I think about my journey, I don't necessarily think about resilience or even really luck, but I think about the key moments that change your perspective, and not just change your life, but sometimes just change how you think about every step that you're taking after. My parents made a decision very early on, as I told you, when I was 1, to leave It was a decision that was forced upon them, and they wanted to fight it, and they fought it in different ways. I would say that when I think about how my parents fought, I think about my grandmother. She never learned to read or write because women weren't allowed to do that back then when in our country. But she raised kids that would be obsessed with reading and writing, and that was her protest. So then it evolved, you know? My parents raised kids that were so obsessed with reading and writing. I've been in school since I was 3 years old. It's crazy. But we also were the people who wanted to challenge what was going on in Sudan in a way that was different than our parents did. So I want to talk to you today about this walk that I did in February. I walked 1,000 kilometers. We finished in March in 30 days for peace. And the way that it happened is a series of moments, just like before. I found myself doing exactly what my parents had to do, solving a series of problems as they come. So the first moment that I want to talk to you about was in August of last year, when I went home for the first time in 4 years, because it's really dangerous to go home. I was standing in the middle of Darfur, and suddenly I saw a billboard, a giant billboard that said, Al-Amn Mas'uliyat al-Jami', which means security is the responsibility of all. And I was like, wait, what? And it had the Janjaweed faces crossed out. Do you guys know who the Janjaweed were? Yeah. And it had their faces crossed out. It had weapons crossed out, and it had these tanks with guns on the back. Some of them were pickup trucks with machine guns or whatever, crossed out. And it was telling us that security is everyone's responsibility. And so I was just like, yo, uncle, like, can you explain to me what's going on here? Am I seeing this right? And he said, yeah, it's for the Weapons for Amnesty program that the government is running to bring peace in Darfur. So I asked more questions, and I found out that what the government was doing is that they were collecting weapons from people that they saw as rebels. And they said they're going to collect these weapons in exchange for amnesty. They're going to create a whole new government arm or force that's going to collect these weapons called the Rapid Defense Forces. And they're going to take them, and that's how they're going to bring peace with more security. And of course, you ask more questions. Things that are usually not very honest fall apart after the third question that you ask. So I was like, okay, so they're collecting weapons. Cool. What for? It's like, oh, they're trying to bring peace. It's like, how? They're bringing more security. Okay, but who are these security forces? Oh, they're just Janjaweed. I was like, what? So it turns out that the government was taking, the head of the Rapid Defense Forces is actually somebody who was a very prominent member of the people who carried out the genocide in Darfur, the Janjaweed. And now suddenly they had a new name and a new face and new outfits, and they were part of the government. And everybody knew about it, but there wasn't very much that we could do. So they were like, yeah, this is what they're doing. And I was like, cool, so what are we going to do about it? And they're like, not die. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So let's unpack that a little bit. What I'm saying is that in Sudan, it's a police state. In a police state, anything that's considered political is inherently dangerous. And it was difficult to get people rallied around this idea if every attempt before that led to death. So I asked people, what do you think peace is? And a lot of people said, well, it's not up to us. When the rebels and the government and the Janjaweed settle whatever it is that's between them, then maybe we can have peace. And that's when I realized it wasn't really about figuring out what it is the government is doing or addressing the security issue, but it was about creating a collective responsibility for peace. If everybody thinks it's somebody else's problem, then you can't have people banding together. So I started moving around and asking more questions. And when I got to the rebels, they said to me, what is this you're talking about? Like, you're trying to bring peace. These people don't want peace. They've never wanted peace. The Sudanese government can't be trusted, and we're just going to do what we need to do. I said to them, what if I walk? Because I had already decided, if they're saying this place is secure, if they're saying it's safe, then I'm going to walk and prove that it's not safe, but in a smarter way than just being like, oh, it's safe? Okay, let me just, no. I was planning it very meticulously. And for the first time in a very long time, they just all froze. And they said, that's a great idea, and we're behind you. But the government is going to kill you. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I went and I talked to the government. of course, months later, after I got more, I'll tell you how I did that, but I talked to them, and they're just like, oh, this is a great idea, but the rebels are going to kill you. And I was like, oh, great, we're on the same page. Cool. So what it became a question of not just having the right intention or thinking that, I'm going to create this collective responsibility for peace. It was about talking to everyone who was anyone ever in this thing called the genocide in Darfur, something I grew up hearing about, something I grew up talking about, something that affected every aspect of my life, even before I was born and even before people called it a genocide. Because the thing is, we're used to talking about war and genocide and conflict in the breaking point or at the finish line. We think about it in finite terms, as if it's something that started at some point, happened, and then ended. But it's never the case. Because the reality is that these things happen way before the explosion, and they are always happening behind the scenes. So what I did is I talked to the UNHCR, I talked to the US Embassy, I talked to all these people behind the scenes, because what I didn't tell you about me is that I'm a Goodwill Ambassador for the UN Refugee Agency. When I was coming up with this project, I wasn't an ambassador. I was still working with UNHCR, but I was in a lot of spaces that my academic background at Yale and my activist background through poetry came together in this really pretty way and just made it very easy for me to get into spaces that people like me normally aren't allowed into. But what I found is in those spaces, everyone was terrified of addressing, Sudan or addressing a political taboo. That's when I hit a really important wall, I think. Everyone started asking me, is this political? And they asked me this in Sudan more than they asked me anywhere else. And that's when I went back to a moment that I want to tell you about. When I was in my senior year of college, 3 people in my life, 2 of my cousins and 1 of their friends, were killed in Indiana. They had escaped everything. They were from Sudan, and they were killed. A month before that, I was sitting with President Obama in a meeting room at a private discussion we had about just everything, which sounds crazy. But we were talking about the violence that happens in our country and other countries, but in ways that is almost covert. We're talking about violence that you don't recognize until it's too late. And then a month after that, my cousins were killed. And so I had to sit there and I had to think, we had this meeting with the president, the most powerful man in the world. Man, those days are gone. Okay, but we had that meeting. We wrote these beautiful letters, and we started, this conversation, this ongoing conversation with him. And it felt like the time lag between when these things are written and when they're affected on the ground is just so immense. How do you address that? How do you navigate the buffer? And that's the position I found myself in. Because I told you earlier that in a police state, anything that is considered political is inherently dangerous. Well, in diplomacy, anything considered political is inherently disruptive. We live in a world of systems, the kind of systems that reward negative behavior and punish speaking up or speaking out. I found myself as part of the diplomatic community, part of the developmental community, part of the activist community, and finding myself worried about what I was going to say next. Well, when I was in Sudan, I couldn't worry about that. So what I did is I kept asking questions until I got to a point where everyone was behind me. On the first day of the walk, more than 350 people showed up in the middle of Al-Fashir. It's the capital of Darfur. There were tanks around us, and they weren't there to protect us. There was security everywhere. They were following us everywhere, but they weren't there for us. They were there because of us. And we changed the history of Darfur in just a moment. And it all just started with talking to people and with poetry and with telling them that this is not political, but if it was, it wouldn't be in a way that would benefit you. And that's what I had to say in one of the government chambers, and it was really scary, but I'll explain that later. Okay. So anyway, what it all came down to was just realizing that if you're honest when everyone else is being dishonest, you'll always be the last one left standing. And so at every point when they were asking us these questions to try and see what our motives were, there were no ulterior motives. I told you things that are not good. After the third question, they completely break down. But we faced question after question, attack after attack, and we just kept standing. And so by the time we marched into Khartoum on the last day of the walk, thousands of people had joined us across the way. And that's what I'll leave you with. I want to leave you with this poem called Mama, about my mom, that I actually was able to say person to person in Sudan, in a place where this kind of language you get punished for. And a funny little thing about censorship, I just told you about how we have to fight it and everything, but just like half an hour ago, I was standing over there being like, am I allowed to say motherfucker? Because my poem is about my mom, and she's a potty mouth, and like there's a line in there where I say that word. And I was like, wait, I'm censoring myself, I'm doing it again. So it's one of those things that is a process. We have to be able to challenge and break down those systems, but we can't do it alone. I called my walk the One Girl Walk, and I'll explain during the questions, I guess. But I called it the One Girl Walk because they told me you're going to walk alone. No one is going to walk with you. No one is going to help you. You know, those guys are going to kill you. Oh, I didn't tell you, the rebels were like, the government are going to kill you, and they're going to blame it on us. That was the second part. But, I said, you know what? I'm willing to walk alone. I'm willing to do this, and I'm willing to do it because no one else will listen unless we do. Okay, so here's the poem. I hope that made sense. Okay. So I'm walking down the street when a man stops me and says, hey, yo, sister, are you from the motherland? Because my skin is a shade too dark not to have come from foreign soil. Because this garment on my head screams Africa. Because my body is a beacon calling everyone to come flock to the motherland. I'm like, yeah, I'm from Sudan. Why? He said, yes, you is, because you got a little bit of flavor in you. Don't get me wrong. I'm just admiring what your mama gave you. Excuse me? Let me tell you something about my mama. She could reduce a man to tattered flesh without so much as blinking. Her words fester beneath your skin, and the whole time, you won't be able to stop cradling her eyes, because my mama is a woman, flawless and formidable in the same step. Woman walks into a war zone and has warriors cowering at her feet. My mama holds all of us in her face, in her body, in her blood, and blood is no good once you let it loose, so she always holds us close, keeping us safe from caving in. When I was 7, my mama cradled bullets in the billows of her robes. That same night, she came home and taught me how to get gunpowder out of cotton with a bar of soap. And years later, when the soldiers held her at gunpoint and asked her who she was, she said, I am a woman. I'm a daughter of Adam. Who the hell are you? And the last time we went home, it's okay to laugh, guys. And the last time we went home, we watched our village burn. Soldiers pouring blood from civilian skulls as if they too could turn water into wine. The woman who raised me turned and said, don't be scared. I'm your mother. I'm here. I won't let them through. My mama gave me conviction. Women like her inherit bruised wrists, tired eyes, and a titanium-plated spine. The daughters of widows wearing the wings of amputees. They carry countries between their shoulder blades. Now, I'm not saying that dating is a first world problem, but these trifling motherfuckers seem to be. The kind who'll quote Rumi, but not know what he sacrificed for war. Who'll fawn over Lupita, but turn their racial filters on, who take their politics with a latte when I take mine with tear gas. Every guy I meet wants me my introduction to the dark side, wants me to open up this obsidian skin and let him read every tearful page, because what survivor hasn't had her struggle made spectacle? Don't talk about the motherland unless you know that being from Africa means waking up an afterthought in this country. Don't talk about my flavor unless you know that my flavor is insurrection, it is rebellion, it is resistance. My flavor is burden, it is grit, and it is compromise. And you don't know compromise until you rebuilt your home for the third time without bricks, without mortar, without any other option. I turned to the man and said, my mother and I don't walk the streets alone back home anymore. Back home, there are no streets to walk anymore. Thank you.
Thank
You guys
so
were
much.
awesome.
We have a very short amount of time for questions, so one very quick one if anyone has something to ask her. Otherwise, you can always come up to her. Oh, yeah, go for it.
Where can I read more?
Oh,
Online.
that's so cool. I actually just published my book. My Sister's Entrance. It's a poetry book. Yeah, cool. And also the interwebs. Oh, The Guardian. Okay, cool.
Guardian. YouTube. I watched all of her YouTube poems before coming.
UNHCR has a lot of BBC cool stuff. But you could just talk to me like a person. I guess I just wanted to clarify something. I was actually talking to you about it yesterday. There was a difficulty that I hit, and almost a moment of disillusionment that I got after working with all of these different organizations, being at the World Economic Forum and all these different places. I found that when I needed them to take a risk, everyone was like, sorry, babe, you're on your own. We love you, but like, you're on your own, man. And I was like, what? And they're like, we don't touch Sudan. And that was almost a rule. It was this rule that we have in diplomacy where you punish countries that are, you punish states that are doing terrible things. The problem is that, just like with that billboard that said security and peace are the same thing, we can't be saying that states and people are the same thing. And so I had to find the people who are willing to help, and I had to find what kind of, aid they were willing to give. Information was really important. I was able to ask, what mistakes did you guys make so I can't repeat them? Fighting 500 years of mistakes, plus, all the diplomacy and all of the issues that went wrong. But that was amazing. Sometimes in spaces where you can't figure out what it is you can do to navigate, you have to figure out what the person can give. If somebody tells you, sorry, my hands are tied, ask them, okay, but like, are your feet tied? This is what we needed to do. And it was beautiful to find out that like we could get water from Doll Group, and Adidas gave me shoes, which is cool. But it was like you had to figure out where the wiggle room is. And I think that with these discussions, we can figure out the wiggle room. Yeah.
Thank you once again.
Yay!